Good evening. It is February 3rd, and welcome to our recap discussion of the storm. This storm is a dangerous storm right now. It's an ice storm, lots of ice storm warnings, especially for places in Texas. This had a very profound impact for those places going really highways which cover from Texas all the way into the Northeast. And however, we're not going to be focusing so much on that. We're going to be focusing more on the fun part of the storm. The fun part of the storm, right? The fun part of the storm is the snow part of the storm. And let's just go back to Monday. It was a complex storm, and that's why I wanted to it's a unique storm, something that we don't usually get here in the Midwest. It happens, but it's not the usual type of storm. So let me just explain the usual type of storm system that affects us, the big storms that affect us here in the Midwest, the ones that produce more than 6 inches, and the ones which are forecasted to produce a widespread 6-inch plus, are those low pressure systems that develop over, let's say, Oklahoma or so, and then they kind of dip a little bit south into Texas. This is called the Panhandle Hook. It collides with lots of Gulf moisture, and then it also collides with an Arctic air mass. The low pressure generally, a lot of times, is under 1,000 MB, which means it's about 29.5 or less. A lot of times 29.4. I remember in 2008, that winter, maybe 2009, 29.4 low pressure brought 14 or 15 inches of snow to Milwaukee. Now, realize when you're trying to figure out the storm's intensity from just the barometric pressure, a major forecaster for the AccuWeather pointed out that for the East Coast, a good indicator to know whether a storm is going to produce a foot or more or not is, does the storm have a barometric pressure of 29.2 or lower? If it's not 29.2, then usually a foot will not be forecasted for the East Coast. Here in the Midwest, I would imagine we have different standards here because it's not so common to get a low pressure of 29.2. But, at the same time, the winter storms don't seem to be as big here in the Midwest. Anyways, we had a low pressure system, which was not really so much Nogea this. It's not really so much connected to the snow, but I'm just going to mention it because it did have a barometric pressure of 29.2, and it actually did play a major role in getting this whole thing started. So that was the low pressure that was located just north of the Minnesota or North Dakota area in southern Canada. And if you looked on the map, it really looked intense. It had a lot of spin to it. 29.3. It was 29.3 on Monday. It moved northeast. I think it intensified to 29.2. Tuesday as well. It might have actually was in just north of North Minnesota on Tuesday, and then it headed northeast. Now, the way these low pressure systems work is that they work counterclockwise. The winds go counterclockwise around the low pressure. So areas to the east of the low pressure have south winds, and areas to the west of the low pressure have north winds. So it brings in all the warm air to the east, which was many areas here in the Midwest, especially the southeast. A lot of times the warm air doesn't quite make it up in the Northeast because it tends to go over the colder air at the surface. But here in Chicago, we were in the warm sector of the system. In fact, much warmer, or at least a little bit warmer than what was forecasted to happen. Temperatures in parts of the Chicago area actually hit 50 degrees on Tuesday. Just amazing. 50 degrees in parts of the Chicago area on Tuesday, and precipitation moved in as well. That's because we had lots of Gulf moisture. This was visible on any weather map you looked at from days ago. Days ago already, was well advertised. The moisture available with the system was well advertised all over the place. You could look at a newspaper weather map anywhere. You could see even the precipitation. It's precipitating throughout the Gulf of Mexico. There's a front south of Miami that was on Tuesday, and the precipitation around the Miami area, and you could see there's rain all over the place, and they have flash flood watches for Texas. Lots of moisture, even without looking at a professional meteorological weather map. Even without that, it was clear that there was lots of moisture available with the system. If you wanted to look at it with more depth, you could look at the National Weather Service. The QPF, which is the amount of water available with the system, was approaching 2 inches, or was 2 inches, forecasted to be 2 inches in the St. Louis area, and looked like that would be about the peak. Now, There is a rumor, or a rumor, and maybe it's true, we're going to talk about it, that the general snow-to-water ratio is 10-1. Now, meteorologist Tom Skilling said for here in Chicago, on average, it's 12-1. So a 2 inch of water equivalent, if that would fall as snow, you would have 24 inches of snow. Now, with this system, phase number 1 was forecasted to be a 10-1 ratio. Phase number 2 was forecasted to be a 13-1 ratio. So you would average around 11 or 12-1. If the whole thing would fall as snow, you would end up with about 20 inches in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, we're going to go ahead and talk about what exactly happened here. So this 29.2 low pressure system, this strong one, it moves by 29.2 to 29.3. It drags a strong cold front. A cold front. All of these systems have a cold front associated with it, and this front was huge. This front went all the way from the Hudson Bay to Texas. Not only that, it's still doing it. The thing still keeps moving. This storm system up in Canada, it's still moving east, and the front just keeps getting longer and longer. It's like you have the front isn't going away from Texas. It just keeps extending and extending, like an extending rod. The front just keeps getting longer and longer. So the front just gets bigger, and the front is barely moving. That storm system up in Canada is moving, but the front is just getting longer and longer. So how is it possible for the storm system with an associated cold front connected to it? How could the storm move east without the cold front moving east? It's very simple. The front just keeps getting longer and longer. Now, the front is moving a little bit towards the southeast. Usually, this is the type of setup that I know I read about pretty frequently in the summertime. You have a front that actually situates itself across the mid part of the country from the southern plains or even the central plains into the Midwest to the mid-Atlantic area. A lot of times it's just north of Baltimore. It separates New York City from Baltimore. It certainly separates, we don't use the word certainly anymore actually, but we go from Baltimore to Providence. There will a lot of times be a front separating the two. Chicago to St. Louis, there's a front. It's the same front. So here we have a front. Now this front it is winter, so we do have the jet stream is further south, and this front is situated well to the south of St. Louis. It even goes south of Little Rock, Arkansas, and even the front is, at this point, it's already south of Texas, and you have the stationary front that became stationary north of New Orleans. They're still in the warm air. Miami, of course, is just beautiful and warm, and that fronts always have a very difficult time. Nothing's ever always, but they have a hard time in the winter, as I've pointed out in the past. Fronts, even in the winter, they do make it through Miami, but a lot of times you'll see they stall just north of Miami. Eventually it makes it through, or they just vanish. So you can look at the map today. We have a series of maps. That's meteorologist Tom Skilling does a great job in the Tribune, and you could just see this front. You see the day-to-day progress of this front. Tomorrow the front hasn't even made it into Florida yet. On Shabbos, the front is making it into northern Florida. On Sunday, the front looks like it's right over Miami. On Monday, the front is just to the southeast of Miami, and on Tuesday, it is starting to possibly move back north as a warm front, and on Wednesday, the front is still around Miami. So this is a front that's moving very slowly, and it will be becoming stationary either just south of Miami, maybe along Miami. It would be interesting to see what the weather forecast, what those temperatures are forecasted to be in Miami. That's the front that we have. Okay, so along this front, we had two main waves of low pressure, different impulses, waves of low pressure that traveled along the front. There was no intense storm system. In a normal situation here in the Midwest, meteorologist Dave Murray, he retired, he's expert, Channel 2 in St. Louis, KTVI. He retired and moved to Hawaii, but he continues to forecast the weather for St. Louis. But in any case, he has always said that in order for the Midwest to have a major winter storm, certainly for the St. Louis area, no more certainties, for the St. Louis area, there's three ingredients necessary. You need deep low pressure, you need copious amounts of moisture, copious amounts of Gulf moisture. It could be any moisture, but in the Midwest, all of our moisture comes from the Gulf. Again, the word all is difficult. In recent times, I've noticed we sometimes manage to get Pacific stuff over here. But the Gulf of Mexico is the main source of moisture around here. And the Arctic air, they collide, there's low pressure. I'm pretty sure it's deep low pressure. But, in this case, we did not have the deep low pressure, and yet forecasts called for more than 6 inches of snow. A major winter storm is defined as more than 6 inches of snow if the precipitation is falling as snow. For ice, it's a 1/4 inch of ice or more. Ice means freezing rain, not sleet. You have freezing rain, a 1/4 inch or more. That's considered a winter storm warning criteria. 6 inches within 12 hours or 8 inches within 24 hours is winter storm criteria in regards to snow. So we have 2 waves of low pressure that's forecast to move along the front. That's very normal, a very reasonable forecast. This stuff happened in the summertime. You get tons of precipitation because of these fronts. So even though there's no organized, intense low pressure system, it is very reasonable to make a forecast for major snow, and that's exactly what happened. We have 2 waves of low pressure that moved along the front. Wave number 1 hit Tuesday night and Wednesday. For Illinois, it was well forecasted. For the Chicago area, for areas south of Chicago, it was well forecasted. The forecast south of Chicago had high confidence. There was not as much confidence to the north, but the forecast materialized anyways. The city saw around the highest amount in the city itself, according to some sources, was 9.5 inches in Lakeview. The Chicago metropolitan area, we had places that got at least 12.5, some counties 13.5, and there was one area in Illinois that saw 14.5 inches, and the same is true for Indiana. There was one area that got 13.5 or 14.5 inches. The amounts dropped off drastically. There was a very sharp gradient. This happens sometimes by snowstorms, not always, but sometimes this happens. And north parts of Chicago, there were areas that did not even get 2 inches. The reason why that happened in this case is because a very strong high pressure, Arctic high pressure. This was also well advertised days before. Last Thursday, it was already known. Amazingly, the high pressure was better advertised than the low pressure. I remember on Thursday making a podcast here, and I couldn't really find any sources for what the low pressure was going to be. I know I mentioned intense low pressure, but I couldn't really find any sources for that. But the intense high pressure, that was well advertised in the forecast discussions back on Thursday. And also the copious amounts of Gulf moisture, again, that you could look anywhere and you could see that. So, and sure enough, that came. That was very dry air. Cold air, Arctic air tends to be very dry. And with the high pressure pushing up as close as it did, that dry air, what it did is it caused the precipitation, no matter how heavy it was, it evaporated before it touched the ground. That was forecasted to happen, and that makes things very hard for meteorologists because when there's a sharp cutoff, it could be very embarrassing for meteorologists because if they're just a little bit off, you could have counties which were expecting 6-7 inches. They end up with close to nothing. Anyways, in this case, there was a sharp cutoff, and the sharp cutoff was said to be in the northern parts of Chicago, and that's exactly what happened. Areas to the north, the Sun-Times reports that there was less than 2 inches. The National Weather Service is not necessarily saying the same thing, but I think it's close. And it could be they are saying the same things. I don't remember seeing numbers like that of less than 2 inches, but in any case, there was a sharp cutoff for the areas north Chicago. Okay, now we go. So that part all came through. Now, here's the 2 waves. 2 waves, that's unique over here. Again, we have 2 waves. The complexity to the system was the different things. Number 1 is that because we're dealing with the front and all this stuff, the precipitation type for much of the country was a puzzle. Was it going to be falling as rain, freezing rain, sleet, or snow? And in many cities, perhaps even most cities, there was a combination of everything. And this was especially true by wave number 2. And this complication is what faced many meteorologists in the south, but not Chicago. The Chicago area didn't have to deal with that type of complication. The complication here was that sharp cutoff for wave number 1. The other complication was the storm track for wave number 2. At one point, the way these things work in the Midwest, generally speaking, these storms, which have Arctic air, copious amounts of Gulf moisture, they have a bullseye of 6 to 12 inches, sometimes a little bit more. If the thing mixes with freezing rain or sleet, of course, you can end up with a little bit less. But generally speaking, you'll see it's classic. Look at the AccuWeather maps every time. 6 to 12, then outside of there is 3 to 6, outside of there is 1 to 3, outside of that's less than to 1. So you just have to figure out in advance what category is your city going to be in. So areas south of Chicago, that's the bullseye. That's 6 to 12 inches. That goes into the South Bend area. You know, from central Illinois up, these things move northeast. You head into north central Indiana, into northeast Indiana. You get into the 6 to 12 inches. That is the bullseye. Areas outside of that is 3 to 6, then 1 to 3. The Chicago area, O'Hare Airport was in the 3 to 6 inch range. They got 5.6 inches of snow. And we did, as we mentioned, there were some locally higher amounts than a foot. That was wave number 1. Now wave number 2 comes. And again, wave number 2 is 6 to 12 inches at the bullseye. There's always locally some higher amounts, maybe 13 or 14 inches. Wave number 2 came today. Now, I don't know exactly what happened, but what I do know is that originally the 2 waves were forecasted to take pretty much the same storm track. But as time went on, the computer models kept forecasting, or the guidance of the models indicated that the second wave was taking a track further to the south than was originally forecasted, and then that trend continued. It kept getting further and further south. So this made a big difference for a city such as South Bend, Indiana, because South Bend, Indiana was forecast to be in the bullseye for both of them. Imagine that, 12 to 24 inches with a possibility, to tell you the truth, of even getting more than 24 inches. That was a possibility. It really was. There was a possibility of even getting more than 24 inches. It was not likely. And it wasn't really in the forecast because of that. But it was possible. It was within the realm of possibility, even like not b'derech nes, no miracles. It could have happened. 12 to 24 inches. And if there would only be 12, technically the forecast would have been accurate, but really, there would have been more than 12. That means to only get 6 inches from both waves when you're in the bullseye for both of them is it's also not so likely to only have 12. But officially, 12 to 24 inches is a very reasonable forecast for South Bend, Indiana. But here's what ended up happening. As time went on, that second wave, as it became clear it's taking more of a southern storm track, so South Bend fell into the 3 to 6 inch category. So now we're down by 3 to 6 inches. So it's no longer 12 to 24. Now we're down to 8. We're down to 9 inches to 9 to 18 inches. We're down to 9 to 18. Then as time went on, South Bend was now going to be in the 1 to 3 inch category. So now we're down to 7 to 14 inches. Okay, does that even make sense? 7 to 15 inches for South Bend. And then as time went on, South Bend, it became clear South Bend's in the 0 inch category. So we're back to the 6 to 12 inches, the original wave. The amount of snow that fell in South Bend was 10.3 inches, I believe. And I also have reason to believe, after being in contact with someone there and from reading things that were within the realm of possibility, that it could very well be that a couple inches melted by the time the storm was done. So there might not be 10.3 inches of snow on the ground. There might only be 8 inches of snow on the ground. Either way, wave number 1 was well forecasted for many, many locations, for places like northern Indiana, but like the northern part of northern Indiana and much of Illinois. The areas which wave number 1 was not well forecasted for were the parts of Indiana where the precipitation remained rain all the way until Wednesday later in the afternoon. The precipitation did not change over to snow until much, much later. Those counties received a lot less snow than what was forecasted. For those places, that forecast was a bust. This first wave messed up. For most areas, the first wave was well forecasted. 6 to 12 inches in the bullseye. The storm track was well forecasted. The changeover for rain to snow, this is another thing that was unique, is that the precipitation started off as rain everywhere, despite the fact that even in the bullseye, the precipitation started off as rain. I mean, every storm, you have areas where the precipitation starts off as rain, but to have that even in the bullseye, that's not so common. But it did start off as rain. It quickly changed over to snow here in Chicago. That front became slower as it moved east. It slowed and slowed and slowed, and the cold air just didn't make it to Indiana in time for the real forecast to materialize. Now we have wave number 2. Wave number 2 was a bust for many cities. Wave number 2 itself, it seemingly happened. We have to hear the updates later tonight after 9 p.m. But there's good reason to believe that there, again, were areas that got 6 to 12, even 8 to 12 inches when you get into central Indiana, southern Indiana. But the storm track, I don't know if there was any city that was in the bullseye for both of them. Assuming that's true, there was no area that would have gotten between 12 and 24 inches, or at least there would be no area that would be getting 20-inch plus snow accumulations as what was originally thought, well within the realm of possibility. We did see some 20-inch plus snow accumulations in Colorado and New Mexico, places like that. We saw large amounts of snow from just wave number 1, as pointed out, more than a foot. Places in Missouri, places in Illinois, places in Indiana. There were places in Michigan of 13.8 inches. We had counties like that. We might end up getting places with 20 inches when you add in the lake effect, when you get up into Michigan. The lake effect snow, again, was pretty much a bust here in Chicago. But it was mentioned that it might be a bust from the beginning. So what we have here is an accurate, for many places, wave number 1 for the snow part. I don't know what went on with the ice storm cities, because that's very complex. And wave number 2 was the system itself was accurate, but the storm track was not. The storm track continued to go further south. So what ends up happening here, since originally this was advertised as one storm, therefore the accuracy could go unnoticed. The parts that were gotten, there was a large part of this which had a lot of accuracy to it, and it may have gone unnoticed because in the very beginning, it was not being advertised as 2 waves. It was being advertised more as one storm. It was one big event, a winter storm warning covering. There was a snowstorm coming. In fact, it was even mentioned that in some locations, the snow might never stop. That's a possibility. I think meteorologists were always aware that it was 2 waves, but it was a vague, exactly what would happen was vague. As time went on, it became clear that there were 2 waves. Once it became 2 waves, so now there's 2 different forecasts which have to be made. Number 1 was a very good job for many locations, and number 2, again, the storm track went further south than what was originally forecasted. That's what we have to say here. I do want to point out that the high pressure, since this is information that was known, was, I believe, 30.9. That was the Arctic high in the back. We look in the weather map today. As of this morning, we see the low pressure system is situated over in Louisiana. It's a front that probably is going all the way up to that other low pressure system in the Hudson Bay. There also is some type of break-off from the polar vortex, I believe, that's also hanging out around in the Hudson Bay. Maybe the 2 are connected. One thing that I do know is that is connected to the cutoff as well. There was a connection that has not been spoken about in recent days, but it was originally that was a hot topic within the National Weather Service, and that was going to determine how far south the storm track was going to be. That may have played a role in the less accurate, or the less the second wave. The track was not known until the last minute, if even that. We'll have to wait and see again what actually happened with that. Okay, so I think that's a recap of much of what happened. I made a previous podcast where I read off a bunch of cities, read through the snowfall accumulations, and this one included some more information about the weather map. and we have a foot of snow headed to the northeast. That's from this storm. That's also a little bit, the way it's happening is a little bit unique. Usually what happens is we have low pressure, goes across the Midwest. The secondary area of low pressure develops off of North Carolina, moves up the coast. Another thing that's common, though, is for in the situations where that doesn't happen, so then it just looks like that's not going to happen, but at the last minute that ends up happening anyways. So we have this wave of low pressure. It's headed off to the northeast, producing snow. I haven't heard about the low pressure developing off in North Carolina, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that on the map tomorrow. Somehow that develops. Somehow these North Carolina just loves. They love to produce low pressure systems. They love it's every time that's going to happen. Let's just. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no, but a good chance that's going to happen. Another remarkable thing I want to point out is that the record high for Chicago yesterday was 52 degrees. Whew. 50. You know how cold that is? 52 degrees. That was the record high yesterday for Chicago, set back in 2020, just 2 years ago. All you have to do is get to 53, and then we break the record. Today's record high, 59 degrees, set back in 1992, and record low for today in Chicago, 19 below zero in 1996. Normal high, 32 degrees. Normal low, 19 degrees. We have a possible snow coming up from a lake effect event on Sunday, and they will be dealt with at that time. The lake water temperature is 33 degrees. Shkia tonight already occurred. It was at 5:08 p.m. here in Chicago. The Tribune shows a weather map that shows the south areas got 8 to 11 inches. South of Chicago, south parts of Chicago, 6 to 10 inches. The O'Hare Airport, 3 to 5 inches. And the northern sections, like Waukegan, 2 inches or less. I want to read one more. I know I've been talking for 27 minutes, but this is something remarkable. Tom Skilling has pointed out that every single time, 8 out of 8 seasons, when Chicago had a very late season start to the first measurable snow, all of them went on to produce below normal snowfall amounts. This year might end up being the exception. I think it was a record this year. It was a record. This year was a record. We had the first measurable snow fell December 28th. That broke the old record set in 2012, set on December 20th. And right now at O'Hare Airport, we have seen 21.4 inches. Normal is 21.8. So we had an amazingly late start to the first measurable snow, and we're only behind normal by 0.4 of an inch. And listen to this. At Midway Airport, this normal is 22.9. We have seen 31.9 inches at Midway. That is because of the lake, partially because of the lake. Also, Midway was more in the first wave affected Midway more than O'Hare. Midway got a lot of snow. They got around 10 inches of snow, whereas O'Hare got about half, 5.6 inches, as we mentioned. I think we will, what's a nice thing to put on? All right. Okay, highest temperature yesterday in the U.S., 86 degrees. Took place in Falcon Lake, Texas. Sometimes says 85 degrees in Zapata, Texas. Coldest temperature back to Peterson's, Utah, 36 degrees below zero. High temperatures today, mid-80s in Orlando, Florida. Now, who's going to be the winner tomorrow? I don't know. If that front made it through Texas today, then Florida is going to be the winner. So we're going to end up with the warmest temperature today probably occurred in Florida, and we'll read about that in tomorrow's paper. I wish everybody good luck with all the ice, and please stay safe and buy lots of salt and You take small steps when you walk. Make sure your hands are out of your pocket. These are safety tips. If you're walking in an area, especially where there's ice, people are encouraged to take smaller steps. It helps them keep their balance. Their hands should not be in their pocket. And when you get out of a car, 3 points of your body should be in contact with something. When you get out of a car, so you have 1 or 2 feet on the ground, 2 feet on the ground, and your hands should be touching something in the car. That's a safety. That's safety. So if there's also any chance that there could be black ice, which any place that could happen here up north, that's something that people might also want to consider. One other tip over here. For those people that have vans, cars that are always getting stuck in the snow, if you take the safety feature, the VSA, if you turn it off just for a moment, you can get out of the snow. You can get your tires to go really fast. You get out of the snow, you won't get stuck as much. And then once you're out, put the thing back on. I've even had a case where you just take the fuse out of the safety feature to get the car going. It's been 31 minutes, and I don't know if I've covered the recap. But in any case, we're going to see if we could play a song. Or is there a song? Is there a nice song? Do we have a song? I think we do. And everyone, thank you for listening. I don't know if anyone's still here. It's been so long. But thank you for listening, and enjoy this final song.